Hey there, dear ones. Go ahead now, find yourself a comfortable spot. Settle in. Dim those lights, pull up that blanket, and just let go. Let your shoulders drop. Unclench your jaw. That's it. Just breathe. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. I've made us a pot of chamomile tea, and I have a story that I think will carry you gently into sleep. It's not a dramatic story, or a frightening one. It's just the story of how women lived. How they married, how they built their days, how they found meaning and moments of quiet joy in a world very different from ours. Tonight, we're going to walk through the medieval world, but not the world of knights and battles and grand tournaments. No, we're going to visit the homes, the hearths, the quiet corners where women spent their lives. We're going to talk about marriage as it really was, not the fairy tales, but the real, lived experience of women from all walks of life, from the great stone castles to the small thatched cottages in the countryside. So close your eyes if you'd like. Or let them drift softly. And let me tell you about these women, and how they lived, and how they loved, and how they endured. Let's begin at the beginning, shall we? With how these marriages came to be in the first place. You see, when a girl was born in medieval Europe, somewhere between the years 500 and 1500, that long stretch of time we call the Middle Ages, her future was already being quietly written. Not by her, of course. Not yet. She was just a baby, after all, wrapped in swaddling clothes, nursed by her mother or a wet nurse, cooing and crying as all babies do. But the adults around her were already thinking ahead. Already planning. Because in the medieval world, marriage wasn't really about the two people getting married. Not in the way we think of it today. It was about families. About property. About alliances and inheritances and the careful weaving together of bloodlines and fortunes. It was practical, you see. Deeply practical. And everyone understood this. It was simply how things were done. Now, let me tell you about a little girl named Marjorie. She's not a real person, not exactly, but she's based on many real girls who lived in England in the 1300s. Marjorie was born to a merchant family in a town, let's say Norwich, a prosperous wool town in East Anglia. Her father dealt in wool and cloth, and her mother managed the household, which included servants, apprentices, and the ever-present rhythm of buying and selling and keeping accounts. Marjorie was about 7 years old when she first heard her parents talking about her future marriage. She was playing with her wooden doll by the fire, half listening to the adult conversation, when she heard her father mention a boy named Thomas, the son of another merchant. The families knew each other. They went to the same church. And Thomas's father had hinted that perhaps, in a few years, when the children were old enough, it might be beneficial for the two families to join together. Marjorie didn't think much about it at the time. 7-year-olds rarely do. She went back to her doll, to her games with her younger brother, to learning her prayers and her letters from the family chaplain. But the conversation had been had. The seed had been planted. This was how it often began. Quietly. Almost casually. Families would discuss matches the way they discussed business deals, because in many ways, that's what they were. A marriage brought together not just two people, but two sets of resources. Two networks of influence. Two futures that would intertwine. For noble families, this was even more pronounced. Let me tell you about Eleanor, a girl born in a castle in southern France in the year 1250. Her father was a minor baron, her mother the daughter of another noble house. Eleanor had lands that would one day be hers, and her marriage would determine who controlled those lands. She was betrothed when she was 9 years old. The agreement was drawn up by lawyers and witnessed by priests. Her future husband was 14, and she had never met him. He lived 3 days' journey away, in another castle, learning to be a knight from his father. The betrothal contract specified the dowry Eleanor would bring, certain lands, certain rents, a sum of money, household goods. It also specified what her husband's family would give her as a dower, the property that would support her if she outlived her husband. Eleanor's mother showed her the contract, though Eleanor couldn't read Latin well enough to understand all the legal phrases. But she understood the essence of it. She would marry this boy, this Robert, when she was 14 or 15. She would leave her home and go to live with his family. She would bear children, God willing, and those children would inherit both her lands and his. Did Eleanor want this? No one asked. It wasn't that her feelings didn't matter at all. A kind mother might try to choose a husband who seemed decent, not cruel, but they weren't the primary consideration. Duty was the primary consideration. Family was the primary consideration. And yet, Eleanor wasn't miserable. She didn't spend her childhood weeping over her fate. She simply accepted it, as children accept the world they're born into. She learned to embroider, to manage servants, to run a noble household. She learned to dance and to sing, because these were accomplishments a lady should have. And sometimes she thought about Robert, and wondered what he looked like, and hoped he would be kind. For peasant girls, the process was different but not entirely unlike the noble experience. Let me tell you about Agnes, who lived in a small village in the north of England in the 1400s. Her father was a tenant farmer, working land that belonged to the local lord. Agnes's family had a small cottage with a thatched roof, a vegetable garden, some chickens, a pig, and strips of field where they grew barley and oats. Agnes wasn't formally betrothed as a child. Peasant families didn't usually draw up contracts years in advance. But by the time Agnes was 12 or 13, her parents were definitely looking. Looking at the boys in the village, at the young men who might make a good match. They wanted someone who was a hard worker, who came from a respectable family, who could help support Agnes and the children they would surely have. There was a boy named John, a year or two older than Agnes, who worked alongside his father in the fields. Agnes had known him all her life. The village was small, perhaps 50 families, and everyone knew everyone. John's family had a bit more land than Agnes's family, which made him a good prospect. And one day, when Agnes was about 14, John's father approached Agnes's father after church and suggested that perhaps the young people might like to walk together, to get to know each other a bit. This was courtship, peasant style. It wasn't about grand romantic gestures. It was about compatibility, about resources, about building a life together. Agnes and John walked together on Sunday afternoons, always with others nearby, never alone. That would have been improper. They talked about simple things. The weather. The crops. Their families. Slowly, they became comfortable with each other. After a few months, the families agreed. The marriage would happen. There would be a small dowry. Agnes's father would give some household goods, perhaps a cow, maybe a little bit of money he had saved. And the couple would live with John's family at first, until they could build or rent their own cottage. Agnes was nervous, but not unhappy. John seemed decent. He didn't drink too much. He went to church. He was strong and could work hard. That was really all anyone could ask for. Now, let me tell you something important. Throughout the medieval period, the church had rules about marriage. And one of those rules was that both parties had to consent. A marriage made by force, the church said, was not a true marriage. This was actually quite progressive for the time. It meant that, in theory, a girl could refuse a match. In practice, of course, it was complicated. A noble girl who refused the match her family had carefully arranged would face enormous pressure. She might be threatened with disinheritance, or with being sent to a convent. But some girls did refuse. There are records of young women who dug in their heels and said no, and their families had to find another match. It didn't happen often, but it happened. For peasant girls, there was sometimes a bit more freedom. If a girl truly hated the boy her parents suggested, she might be able to persuade them to look elsewhere. But resources were limited, and choices were few. Most girls simply accepted what their parents arranged. And here's something else. While marriage was primarily practical, that didn't mean there was no room for affection. Many couples grew to love each other over time. They built lives together, raised children together, worked side by side. Love wasn't the starting point, But it could be the ending point. It could grow slowly, like a garden planted in spring that blooms by summer's end. Let's talk about the weddings themselves now. The ceremonies. The customs. The way a girl became a wife. In the early medieval period, marriage was actually quite simple from a legal standpoint. If a man and woman agreed to marry each other, said their vows to each other, and then lived together as husband and wife, they were married. That was it. No priest required. No church ceremony. Just mutual consent and consummation. Of course, families wanted witnesses. They wanted it to be public, to be official, so there could be no doubt later about property or inheritance. So even in the early Middle Ages, couples would typically exchange their vows in front of witnesses, family members, neighbors, friends. But as the centuries passed, the church became more and more involved in marriage. By the later medieval period, especially after the 12th century, the church was insisting that marriages should take place at the church door, with a priest presiding. This became the standard way to marry. Let me describe a typical wedding for you. Close your eyes and picture this with me. It's a summer morning in the year 1380. We're in a village in the English countryside. The church is small, made of stone, with a square tower and narrow windows. In front of the church, under the wooden porch that shelters the entrance, a crowd is gathering. There's Agnes, our peasant girl, wearing her best dress. It's not white. White wedding dresses won't become standard for centuries yet. Instead, her dress is a deep blue, the nicest dress she owns, the one she wears to church on feast days. Her mother has woven flowers into her hair. She's wearing a new pair of shoes, stiff and uncomfortable, but special. Next to her is John, wearing a clean tunic and hose, his hair combed, looking nervous. Around them are their families, their friends, their neighbors. The whole village has turned out. A wedding is a community event, you see. Everyone wants to witness it, to celebrate it, to be part of it. The priest comes out of the church, wearing his vestments. He stands before the couple and asks them, in English, not Latin, because this part is too important for anyone to misunderstand, whether they freely consent to this marriage. John, wilt thou have this woman to thy wife, and love her and keep her in sickness and in health, and in all other degrees be to her as a husband should be to his wife, and all other forsake for her, and hold thee only to her, to thy life's end? John says, I will. Then the priest asks Agnes the same question, and she too says, I will. They exchange vows to each other, repeating words after the priest. John takes Agnes's hand. He might give her a ring, if his family can afford one. Wedding rings were common even among peasants, simple bands of silver or brass. He places it on her finger, moving it from thumb to forefinger to middle finger to ring finger, saying, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. And that's it. They're married. The priest blesses them, and then everyone proceeds into the church for a mass. But the actual marriage vows happened outside, at the church door, in full view of the community. After the mass, there's a feast. For a peasant wedding, this might be held in someone's house, or outside if the weather is good. There's ale, lots of ale. There's bread and cheese and perhaps a pig has been roasted. There's music, someone plays a pipe, someone else a drum. People dance in a line, holding hands, weaving in patterns. Agnes and John are given the best seats, the best portions of food. They're toasted again and again. As the evening comes on, there's a tradition that must be followed. The couple must be bedded. This isn't as scandalous as it might sound, it's a ritual, witnessed but also private in its way. Agnes and John are escorted to their new home, or to the room they'll be staying in. Friends and family crowd in, making jokes, offering advice, being rowdy and merry. The couple gets into bed, still clothed. A priest might come to bless the bed. And then, finally, everyone leaves and the couple is alone. This consummation was important, you see. A marriage wasn't fully valid until it was consummated. That was both church law and civil law. So the bedding ritual ensured that everyone knew the marriage was complete. Now let me tell you about a noble wedding. The structure was similar, but the scale was so much grander. Picture Eleanor, our noble girl, now 15 years old. She's marrying Robert, who is 20. The wedding takes place at the church near Robert's family castle. This isn't a small village church. This is a large stone church with stained glass windows, with side chapels, with a proper bell tower. Eleanor is dressed magnificently. Her gown is made of silk, dyed a rich crimson red. The sleeves are long and lined with fur. She wears a circlet of gold on her head, holding in place a veil of fine linen. Her hair has been brushed until it shines and hangs loose down her back, a sign of her virginity. The guests aren't just villagers. They're nobles from all around the region. Lords and ladies, knights, wealthy merchants. They've been traveling for days to be here. Eleanor's parents have come, of course, and many of her relatives. Robert's family has filled their castle with guests, and the feast afterward will last for days. The ceremony at the church door is the same, though. The same vows. The same questions. Eleanor and Robert both say "I will," though Eleanor's voice is so quiet that the priest has to ask her to repeat herself. She's terrified, poor thing. She barely knows Robert. They've met perhaps 3 times before this day, always surrounded by family, never alone. Robert places a ring on her finger, a good gold ring with a small ruby. They proceed into the church for the Mass, which is long and elaborate, with incense and chanting and prayers in Latin that Eleanor doesn't entirely understand. And then the feast. Oh, the feast. In the great hall of the castle, tables have been set up in a U shape. The high table, where Eleanor and Robert sit with their parents and the most important guests, is on a raised platform. There are tapestries on the walls, rushes on the floor mixed with herbs so that the hall smells of lavender and rosemary. Course after course is brought out. Roasted swans, their feathers replaced after cooking so they look alive. Venison. Fish pies. Jellies colored in bright hues. Subtleties, elaborate sculptures made of sugar and marzipan, showing castles and ships and mythical beasts. There's wine, good imported wine from France and Spain. Minstrels play in the gallery. There's singing and dancing. Eleanor barely eats. Her stomach is in knots. She smiles and nods and tries to be gracious, as her mother taught her. Robert sits beside her, drinking rather a lot of wine, laughing with his friends. When the evening grows late, the bedding ceremony begins. Eleanor is escorted to the bedchamber by the women, her mother, her aunts, Robert's mother, the other noble ladies. They undress her and put her in a fine linen nightgown. They tuck her into the great bed with its heavy curtains and embroidered coverlets. They give her advice, some of it kind, some of it embarrassingly frank. Then the men bring Robert. He's also in his nightgown. A priest blesses the bed. Everyone crowds around, making jokes, some of them quite bawdy. Eleanor is mortified. But finally, mercifully, everyone leaves, drawing the bed curtains closed. And Eleanor and Robert are alone. Truly alone together for the first time. They must consummate the marriage. Eleanor knows this is her duty. She's been told it will hurt the first time. Robert is also nervous, though he tries not to show it. He's more experienced, he's been to war, he's been with women before. But this is different. This is his wife. This matters. I won't go into detail about what happens next. That's private, even across centuries. But by morning, the marriage is complete. The sheets are inspected, another ritual, to prove Eleanor's virginity. And the next day, the feast continues, and Eleanor is now a married woman, a wife, with all the duties and expectations that entails. Let's talk about those duties now. About what daily life was like for a married woman in the medieval world. Because this is where women really lived, in the steady rhythm of days and seasons. For Eleanor, our noble lady, daily life in her new home was a complex dance of management and supervision. You see, a noble household wasn't just a family. It was a small community. There were servants, many servants. Kitchen servants, stable hands, grooms, maids, ladies-in-waiting, men-at-arms, chaplains, stewards, bailiffs. Dozens of people, sometimes hundreds, all depending on the household for their livelihood. And Eleanor, as the lady of the household, was responsible for managing all of this. Under her mother-in-law at first, she had to learn, after all, but eventually on her own. Eleanor's day began early. She woke at dawn, or even before dawn in the summer. She dressed with the help of her maid, putting on layers of clothing, a linen chemise, a gown, a surcoat, a belt, a veil to cover her hair because married women kept their hair covered. She washed her face and hands in a basin of water. She said her morning prayers, kneeling at the small altar in her chamber. Then she went to the chapel for Mass. The household attended Mass together every morning. It was part of the rhythm of the day, a way to mark time, to ask for God's blessing on the work ahead. After Mass, Eleanor broke her fast. Just a bit of bread and ale, perhaps some cheese. Medieval people didn't eat large breakfasts the way we do. The main meal was dinner, which happened around midday. Then the work of the day began. Eleanor met with the steward to go over accounts. She needed to know how much grain was in the stores, how much wine, how much salt and spices. She needed to plan menus, to decide what would be served at dinner and supper. She needed to authorize purchases, to ensure that servants weren't stealing or wasting resources. She inspected the kitchen, the storerooms, the dairy. She checked on the progress of various projects, the making of candles, the spinning and weaving of cloth, the brewing of ale. A noble household produced many of its own necessities, and Eleanor oversaw all of this production. She also had to manage the servants themselves, settle disputes, assign tasks, ensure that everyone was doing their work. This required diplomacy, firmness, and patience. Some servants had been with the household for years and resented taking orders from a young girl. Eleanor had to win their respect. In the afternoon, after dinner, Eleanor might have a bit of leisure. She would sit with her ladies, and they would do embroidery together, working on altar cloths for the chapel or decorative hangings for the hall. They would talk quietly, exchanging news and gossip. Sometimes a minstrel would come and sing for them. Sometimes someone would read aloud from a book, a romance, perhaps, or saints' lives. But this leisure was also work, in its way. Embroidery wasn't just a pastime. It was a valuable skill, and the things Eleanor and her ladies made were important items, both practical and symbolic. And the conversations they had while they sewed were where alliances were formed, where information was exchanged, where the social fabric of the household was woven. Eleanor also had duties to the broader estate. Her husband Robert was often away, fighting in wars, attending the king's court, managing his other properties. When he was gone, Eleanor was in charge. She met with the bailiff who oversaw the tenant farmers. She held manorial court, hearing disputes and rendering judgments. She made decisions about planting and harvesting, about repairing roads and bridges, about all the work that kept the estate running. This was a heavy responsibility for a young woman. But Eleanor rose to it, as so many women did. She learned to be firm when necessary, to be fair, to be wise. She learned to read accounts, to assess people's honesty, to make difficult decisions. Now let me tell you about Agnes, our peasant woman, and her daily life. It was different from Eleanor's, but no less full, no less demanding. Agnes and John lived in a small cottage with one main room and a loft above where they slept. The floor was beaten earth. There was a central hearth for cooking and warmth, with a hole in the roof for the smoke to escape. The furniture was simple, a table, a few stools, a chest for storing clothes and valuables, a bed frame with a straw mattress. Agnes woke at first light, same as Eleanor. She had to. There was too much to do to waste daylight. She started the fire from the banked coals of the night before, adding sticks and then larger pieces of wood. She fetched water from the well in the village center, carrying it in a wooden bucket. This was often a daily task, sometimes multiple times a day. She made breakfast, porridge, usually, made from oats or barley. She and John ate standing up or sitting on stools, using wooden bowls, eating with their fingers and wooden spoons. Then the day's work truly began. Agnes's work changed with the seasons, because her life was tied to the agricultural cycle. In spring, there was planting to be done. Agnes worked alongside John in the fields, helping to sow seeds, to spread manure, to clear rocks. Yes, women did field work. Not always the heavy ploughing, that was typically men's work, but much of the rest of it. In summer, there was weeding, tending, watching over the crops. There was also sheep shearing, and Agnes knew how to shear a sheep. The wool was valuable. Some of it they sold, but some Agnes kept, and she would spend long hours spinning it into thread, using a drop spindle. She did this while watching the children, or while sitting outside her door, or in the evening by firelight. In autumn, there was harvest. This was the busiest time of year. Everyone worked from dawn to dusk, cutting grain with sickles, bundling it into sheaves, hauling it to the barn. It was back-breaking work. Agnes's hands blistered and her back ached. But it had to be done. The harvest determined whether they would eat well in the coming year or go hungry. In winter, the pace slowed a bit. There was still work, caring for animals, threshing grain, repairing tools, spinning and weaving, but it was less frantic. Winter was also the hungry time, when stores ran low and everyone ate more sparingly. In addition to field work, Agnes had her own responsibilities. She tended the vegetable garden behind the cottage, growing onions, leeks, cabbages, peas. She cared for the chickens, collecting eggs, keeping them safe from foxes. She made cheese from the milk of their cow. She baked bread in the communal oven. The village had one large oven, and women took turns using it. She brewed ale. This was a crucial task. Water was often unsafe to drink, but ale was safer because the brewing process boiled the water. Every household brewed ale regularly, and it was almost always the woman's job. Agnes would malt barley, boil it with herbs for flavoring, let it ferment. It was a skilled task, and good brewsters, female brewers, were valued. She also made and mended clothing for her family. She would spin thread, weave it into cloth on a small loom, then cut and sew it into tunics and hose. When clothes wore out, she patched them. Nothing was wasted. A tunic that was too worn to repair would be cut up and the good parts made into something else, a cap, a pouch, rags for cleaning. And if Agnes was very skilled and very lucky, she might make a little extra money from her work. Perhaps she was known for her ale and sold some to neighbors. Perhaps her cheese was especially good. Perhaps she had a surplus of eggs. These little bits of money were hers to keep and use as she saw fit. It gave her a small measure of economic independence, which was not nothing. Both Eleanor and Agnes, noble and peasant, were also responsible for the sick in their households. There were no hospitals as we know them, no family doctors making house calls. Healing was women's work. Eleanor kept a still room where herbs were dried and medicines prepared. She knew how to make poultices for wounds, teas for fevers, salves for burns. She had probably learned some of this from her mother, and some from books. There were medical texts available to noble women, often in the vernacular rather than Latin. When a servant fell ill, Eleanor visited them, bringing medicine, sometimes bringing food from her own table. When a tenant's child was sick, Eleanor might be called on to help. This was part of her duty, her role as lady of the manor. She was expected to be charitable, to care for those under her husband's protection. Agnes, too, knew herbal medicine. She had learned from her mother and from the other women in the village. She knew which plants helped with which ailments. Willow bark for pain. Feverfew for headaches. Chamomile for digestion and sleep. She gathered these herbs from the woods and fields, dried them, stored them. When someone in the village was ill, the women gathered to help. They took turns sitting with a sick person, bringing food, administering remedies, praying. This was community care, women caring for each other across generations. Now, let's talk about something that was central to medieval marriage, childbearing. Because this was, in many ways, what marriage was for. Children. Heirs. The continuation of the family line. Women were expected to have children, and to have many of them. High infant and child mortality meant that families needed to have many children for a few to survive to adulthood. And so pregnancy was a near constant state for married women during their childbearing years. Let me tell you about Eleanor's first pregnancy. She was 16 years old. She had been married for about a year when she realized she had missed her monthly courses. She told her mother-in-law, who confirmed it, yes, Eleanor was with child. There was great rejoicing. This was what everyone had been waiting for. Eleanor's pregnancy proceeded through the seasons. She felt nauseous in the early months, could barely eat. But her mother-in-law told her this was normal, even a good sign. It meant the baby was strong. As her belly grew, Eleanor's clothes were let out. She continued to work, to manage the household, though she tired more easily. The household prepared for the birth. Linens were gathered. A birthing chamber was prepared, usually the lady's own bedchamber, but arranged specially. The windows would be covered to keep out drafts and light. The room would be kept warm. It would be a space entirely for women. When Eleanor went into labor, it was her mother-in-law who noticed first. The pains in Eleanor's back, coming regularly. The show of blood. Eleanor was taken to the birthing chamber. A midwife was summoned, an experienced woman from the nearest town, known for her skill. Robert was not present. Men did not attend births. This was women's work, women's space. Robert paced in the hall below, drinking with his friends, trying not to think too hard about what was happening above. In the birthing chamber, Eleanor was surrounded by women. Her mother-in-law. Her ladies. The midwife. They gave her drinks to ease the pain, wine mixed with herbs. They encouraged her, told her she was doing well, reminded her to pray. Eleanor walked around the room during the early part of labor, as the midwife instructed. Later, when the pains were very strong, she knelt on a birthing stool, a low stool with a cutout seat, and the midwife crouched before her, ready to catch the baby. Labor was dangerous. Women died in childbirth regularly. Everyone knew this. Eleanor knew it. She had made her confession to a priest before going into labor, just in case. She had made sure her affairs were in order. But Eleanor was lucky. After many hours of labor, it seemed like an eternity, but perhaps it was 8 hours, perhaps 12, the baby was born. A boy. An heir. He cried lustily, and the women exclaimed with joy. The midwife cut the cord, washed the baby, swaddled him tightly. Eleanor, exhausted and trembling, was helped into bed. The baby was taken to Robert, who held his son and felt a fierce pride. An heir. He had done his duty. Eleanor had done hers. Eleanor's churching would come later, about a month after the birth. This was a ceremony of purification and thanksgiving. Childbirth made a woman ritually unclean. According to church teaching, it was the blood, you see. So after birth, a woman stayed mostly in seclusion until her churching. Then she would go to the church, be blessed by the priest, and be welcomed back into the community. Eleanor would have many more pregnancies. Some would end in miscarriage. Some babies would be stillborn. Some would die in infancy, despite all Eleanor's care. This was normal. This was life. Eleanor learned to bear it, to grieve privately, to keep going. Now let me tell you about Agnes and childbirth, because it was both similar and different. Agnes was pregnant within months of her marriage. This was expected. She told John when she was sure, and he was pleased. Another pair of hands, eventually, to help with the work. Agnes worked throughout her pregnancy. There was no lying about, no being pampered. She fetched water and worked in the fields and made bread and did everything she had always done, just with a growing belly. She felt the baby move inside her, and it was strange and wonderful. When her time came, Agnes's mother came to help, and her mother-in-law, and a neighbor woman who had experience with births. They didn't have a professional midwife, those cost money. But these women knew what to do. They had all done this before, had all given birth, had all helped others give birth. Agnes labored in her cottage, in the one room, by the fire. She gripped a rope that John had hung from a roof beam, using it to bear down when the pains came. The women rubbed her back, gave her drinks of ale and wine, prayed with her. Agnes was young and strong, and the birth went well. A girl. Agnes felt a moment of disappointment. Everyone hoped for a boy first, but then she held her daughter and felt only love. They named her Emma, after John's mother. Agnes got up the next day and went back to work. Peasant women didn't have the luxury of a long lying-in period. There was too much to do. She wrapped Emma in a sling and carried her as she went about her tasks. She nursed Emma whenever the baby cried, stopping her work, sitting down for a few minutes, then continuing. Agnes would have more children. 7 pregnancies over the years. 3 of the babies died, 1 in infancy, 2 in early childhood. Each death was a grief that never entirely healed. But Agnes kept going. She had to. There was work to do, other children to care for, life to live. Let me tell you about raising children, because this too was central to women's lives. For the first few years, children were entirely in the women's world. Boys and girls both stayed with their mothers, learning by watching, by imitating, by being gently or not so gently corrected. Eleanor's son, let's call him William, was nursed by a wet nurse. This was common for noble families. Eleanor's breasts were bound so her milk would dry up, and William was given to a healthy peasant woman whose own baby had recently been born. This wet nurse lived in the castle, and William spent most of his time with her for the first 2 or 3 years of his life. This might seem strange to us, but it was normal then. And it had a practical purpose. Breastfeeding delays the return of fertility, so by not nursing her own child, Eleanor could become pregnant again sooner. The goal was to have multiple sons, heirs and spares, as it were, and so the noble family wanted Eleanor bearing children as quickly as possible. When William was weaned, he came back to Eleanor's care more fully. He had a nursery, supervised by a nurse and maids. He wore long gowns, as all small children did. He played with toys, a wooden horse, a leather ball, a set of carved animals. He was taught his prayers by the chaplain. Around age 7, William's education became more formal. He might be sent to another noble household to be a page, to learn courtesy and service and the skills of a knight. Or he might stay home and be taught by a tutor. But either way, he was moving into the men's world now, learning men's skills. If Eleanor had daughters, they stayed with her longer. They learned the skills they would need as wives and mothers. They learned to spin and sew, to manage servants, to oversee a household. They learned to read and write, at least a little. More and more noble women were literate as the Middle Ages progressed. They learned courtly behavior, how to dance, how to sing, how to be gracious. They also learned about marriage and childbirth. Not in explicit detail, perhaps, but in the way all girls learned, by watching, by listening to the women around them, by absorbing the reality of women's lives. Agnes raised her children differently, of course. Little Emma was nursed by Agnes herself, for 2 or 3 years. While Agnes worked, Emma was strapped to her back, or placed in a cradle nearby, or watched by an older sibling. As Emma got older, she began to help with small tasks. At 3 or 4, she might feed the chickens. At 5 or 6, she could collect eggs, pull weeds in the garden, fetch small amounts of water. At 8 or 9, she was learning to spin thread, to help with cooking, to watch over younger siblings. Emma's education happened through daily life. She learned to make bread by helping Agnes make bread. She learned to brew ale by watching and then doing. She learned to sow seeds, to weed, to harvest. She learned the rhythms of the agricultural year, the feast days of the church calendar, the names of plants and animals and stars. Emma didn't learn to read. Most peasant children didn't. Books were expensive, education was expensive, and there was no need for it in a peasant's life. But Emma learned hundreds of practical skills, and she learned the wisdom that was passed down through generations of women: how to predict weather, how to preserve food, how to care for the sick, how to manage a household on almost nothing. Agnes's sons learned men's work. They went to the fields with John as soon as they were big enough to help. They learned to plow, to sow, to reap. They learned to care for animals, to repair tools, to build and thatch. And when they were teenagers, strong and capable, they were full workers, contributing significantly to the family's survival. Now let's talk about the relationships within marriage. Between husband and wife. Because this was the core of it all, wasn't it? These two people, joined together, building a life. Eleanor and Robert's relationship evolved over the years. At first, they were strangers. Robert was often away, and when he was home, he spent much of his time with his men, hunting or training or drinking. Eleanor ran the household and tried to please her mother-in-law. But slowly, they came to know each other. They had conversations, usually practical ones, about the estate, about the children, about decisions that needed to be made. They developed a partnership. Robert came to respect Eleanor's intelligence and capability. He trusted her to manage things in his absence. He asked her opinion on matters. Did they love each other? Perhaps. In their way. It wasn't the passionate romance of songs and stories. But there was affection, trust, mutual respect. When Robert came home from a journey, Eleanor was genuinely glad to see him. When Eleanor was ill, Robert was genuinely concerned. They also had physical relations, of course. This was part of marriage, an expected part. The church taught that the marriage debt, the duty to have relations with one's spouse, was owed by both partners. Either could demand it of the other. In practice, of course, it was usually the husband initiating. But Eleanor had the right to refuse if Robert was asking for something the church considered sinful. There were rules about proper times, proper positions. Over time, their physical relationship probably became more comfortable. They learned each other's bodies, learned what was expected. It was a duty, but it wasn't necessarily unpleasant. Medieval people weren't as prudish as Victorian people would later be. They understood that physical pleasure existed, even if they didn't talk about it openly. Agnes and John's relationship was perhaps more equal in some ways. They worked side by side. They had to cooperate closely to survive. Their lives were so intertwined that they had to communicate constantly. John was the head of the household, officially. He made the final decisions. He represented the family in legal matters, in dealings with the Lord. But in practice, Agnes had considerable influence. She managed the money, she decided what to cook and what to keep for later, she had her own areas of expertise that John deferred to. They argued sometimes. About money, about children, about work. Life was stressful, resources were tight, and tempers could flare. But they also laughed together, made jokes, had moments of tenderness. Their physical relationship was probably more straightforward. Peasants tended to be less burdened by ideas about sin and purity. They were earthier, more practical. Relations between husband and wife were normal, even enjoyable. Agnes might have complained to the other women about John's demands, or made jokes about men, but she also shared a bed with him every night, and there was intimacy in that. Not all marriages were kind, of course. Some husbands were cruel. They beat their wives, demanded too much, showed no affection. Medieval society generally accepted a husband's right to discipline his wife, though there were limits. He shouldn't beat her so severely that he caused permanent injury. But those limits were often ignored. Some wives were trapped in miserable marriages with no escape. Divorce barely existed. The church didn't allow it. An annulment was possible under certain circumstances, if it could be proved that the marriage was never valid in the first place, perhaps because of too close blood relation, or because one party had been forced into it. But annulments were rare, expensive, and almost impossible for anyone but the very rich to obtain. So women endured. They found ways to cope. They built relationships with their children, with other women. They took pride in their work, in their skills. They found small joys, a warm fire on a cold day, a baby's laugh, the taste of honey, the satisfaction of a task well done. And some marriages were genuinely happy. Some couples did fall in love, or grow to love each other. Some husbands were kind and some wives were cherished. Medieval people were people, after all, with all the capacity for love and kindness that people have always had. Let me tell you about relationships with in-laws, because this was a significant part of married life, especially for women. When Eleanor married Robert, she left her birth family and joined his family. She lived in his family's castle, under the authority of his mother. This was the norm. The bride joined the groom's household. Eleanor's mother-in-law was the lady of the castle, and Eleanor was subordinate to her. This could be difficult. Some mothers-in-law were kind and welcoming, eager to teach and support the new bride. Others were critical, jealous of their authority, reluctant to share power. Eleanor's mother-in-law was somewhere in between. She wasn't cruel, but she was exacting. She expected Eleanor to learn quickly, to remember everything, to never question her decisions. Eleanor tried her best, but she made mistakes, and each mistake brought a sharp rebuke. It was only after several years, after Eleanor had borne children and proved herself capable, that her mother-in-law began to soften. She started to ask Eleanor's opinion. She allowed Eleanor to make more decisions independently. And when Robert's father died and Robert became the lord, Eleanor became the lady, and her mother-in-law retired to a dower house on another part of the estate. Then Eleanor was in charge at last. It was a relief and also a burden. So much responsibility. But she had learned well, and she was ready. Agnes's experience with her mother-in-law was also mixed. She and John lived with his parents at first, in the same cottage. This meant Agnes was under her mother-in-law's authority, had to follow her mother-in-law's ways of doing things. Agnes's mother-in-law was set in her ways. She had been running that household for 30 years, and she didn't appreciate a young girl questioning her methods. Agnes learned to keep quiet, to do as she was told, to wait for the rare moments when she and John were alone to express her frustrations. But after a few years, John's father gave them a plot of land, and John built a small cottage. Agnes and John moved into it with their children. Finally, Agnes had her own household to run as she saw fit. It was a small cottage, a humble household, but it was hers. That meant a great deal. Relationships with birth families also remained important. Eleanor's parents visited sometimes, and she visited them. These visits were opportunities to see family, but they were also diplomacy. The alliance between the families, forged by Eleanor's marriage, had to be maintained. Eleanor's letters to her mother, or rather, the letters she dictated to a scribe, because even literate noble women often didn't write their own correspondence, were full of news about children, about the estate, about health and weather and all the mundane details of life. These letters kept the connection alive across distance. Agnes saw her own mother regularly, they lived in the same village, after all. They helped each other with work, cared for each other's children, supported each other through illnesses and difficulties. This was one advantage of peasant life. Family stayed close. The community was tight-knit. Let me talk now about the social expectations and limitations that defined medieval women's lives. Because women were constrained by laws, by customs, by the teachings of the Church. Understanding these constraints helps us understand how women navigated their lives. The Church taught that women were subordinate to men. This came from the Bible, from the story of Eve tempting Adam, from St. Paul's letters about wives obeying husbands. Women were seen as weaker, more easily led astray, in need of male guidance. Women couldn't be priests. They couldn't preach in church. They couldn't hold most positions of official authority. Legally, in many places, married women couldn't own property independently, their property belonged to their husbands. They couldn't make contracts without their husband's permission. In court, their testimony was often given less weight than men's testimony. But within these constraints, women found power and agency. Eleanor, as lady of the manor, exercised real authority over the household and estate. When Robert was away, which was often, she made decisions that affected hundreds of people. She held court, settled disputes, managed finances. Yes, she did this in her husband's name, but the power was real nonetheless. Noble women could also be patrons of the arts, of literature, of the church. They commissioned manuscripts, supported poets and minstrels, funded the building of chapels. Eleanor, as she grew older and wealthier, did some of this. She had a beautiful book of hours made for her own use, illuminated with gold leaf and bright colors. She gave money to the local monastery to say masses for her soul. Some noblewomen became very powerful indeed. If a woman was widowed and her son was too young to inherit, she might serve as regent, ruling in his name. There are many examples of such women throughout medieval Europe, women who ruled kingdoms, who led armies, who shaped politics. And even for women who weren't widowed, widowhood was a kind of freedom. A widow was legally independent. She controlled her dower property. She could make her own decisions, run her own life. Many widows chose not to remarry, preferring their independence to the subordination of marriage. For peasant women like Agnes, the constraints were different but also real. Agnes couldn't own land in her own name. She couldn't make legal agreements. Her husband spoke for the family in all official matters. But Agnes still had her own sphere of authority. She controlled the household. She made decisions about food, about children's upbringing, about hospitality. She could earn her own money from brewing or selling eggs, and that money was hers. In the village community, she had her own reputation, her own relationships, her own voice. Women also sometimes worked outside the home. In towns and cities, women worked as brewsters, as bakers, as silk workers, as merchants. Widows often continued their late husbands' businesses. Some guilds, the organizations that controlled various trades, allowed women members, usually widows of guild members. Women couldn't do all jobs, of course. They couldn't be blacksmiths or heavy laborers. They weren't supposed to have authority over men. But within the areas open to them, they worked hard and contributed significantly to the medieval economy. The Church, despite its teaching about female subordination, also offered women one route to independence and authority: religious life. A woman could become a nun, joining a convent, taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Life in a convent was constrained in its own ways. Nuns were under the authority of an abbess and, ultimately, of male church officials. They spent their days in prayer and work. But convent life also offered things that secular life didn't. In a convent, women could be educated. They could learn to read Latin, study theology, copy manuscripts. The greatest female writers and thinkers of the medieval period were often nuns, women like Hildegard of Bingen, who wrote music and theological treatises, or Julian of Norwich, who wrote mystical revelations. An abbess, the head of a convent, had real power. She managed the convent's lands and finances, supervised the nuns, represented the convent in legal matters. Some abbesses ruled over large estates and had authority over both nuns and monks. For some women, religious life was a genuine calling, a desire to devote themselves to God. For others, it was chosen by their families, a place to send a younger daughter who wouldn't inherit, or a woman who couldn't find a suitable marriage. But either way, it was an alternative to marriage, a different way to live a woman's life. Now let me tell you about the regional variations in women's experience of marriage. Because Europe in the Middle Ages was not a single unified culture. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, principalities, counties, and duchies, each with its own laws and customs. In England, the law was relatively favorable to women compared to some places. Women could inherit property if there were no male heirs. A widow had the right to 1/3 of her husband's estate as her dower. Women could make wills, could sue and be sued in court. In parts of France, customs varied widely. In the north, laws were similar to England's. In the south, Roman law was more influential, and under Roman law, women had less independence. A woman was under her father's authority until marriage, then under her husband's authority, then, if widowed, possibly under her son's authority. In the Italian city-states, wealthy families were very concerned with preserving their wealth and status. Marriages were dynastic alliances. Dowries were enormous, so large that they could bankrupt a family with several daughters. A woman's dowry was her only inheritance, she had no claim on her father's property otherwise. In Scandinavia, women seem to have had more freedom than in southern Europe. Norse women could own property, run farms in their husband's absence, even initiate divorce under certain circumstances. The Viking Age had passed by the high medieval period, but some of those older customs persisted. In Spain, the Reconquista, the long campaign to retake the peninsula from Muslim rule, created some unusual opportunities for women. In frontier areas, where population was sparse and land was being resettled, women could sometimes own land and property more freely than in more established regions. And of course, there were differences between urban and rural life. In cities, women had access to trade, to guilds, to markets. A woman in London or Paris or Florence had different opportunities than a woman in a rural village. She might learn a trade, run a shop, interact with a wider world. These regional and cultural variations meant that there was no single medieval woman's experience. But across all these differences, some things remained constant. Women married young. They bore children. They worked hard. They were legally subordinate to men but found ways to exercise agency within those constraints. They built lives, relationships, communities. Let me tell you about the later years of marriage, about what happened as women aged. Eleanor, in her 40s and 50s, saw her children grow up and marry. Her daughters were sent to other households, married to men chosen to benefit the family. Her son William married and brought his wife to live at the castle. Eleanor helped guide her daughter-in-law, trying to be kinder than her own mother-in-law had been. When Robert died, from a fever, in his early 50s, Eleanor became a widow. She was still relatively young, only 45. She could have remarried. There were men who would have been interested in her dower lands and her connections. But Eleanor chose not to remarry. She had fulfilled her duty. She had borne children, managed the household for decades, done everything that was asked of her. Now, as a widow, she had a measure of independence she had never had before. She retired to the dower house, a small manor that was hers by right. She took some of her ladies with her, the ones who had served her for years. She brought her favorite belongings, her book of hours, her embroidered hangings, her small dog. In the dower house, Eleanor lived quietly. She oversaw the small estate, but it was manageable, not overwhelming. She spent time in prayer and contemplation. She did embroidery, beautiful work that she donated to the church. She saw her grandchildren when they visited. She grew old peacefully, which was more than many women could say. Eleanor died in her 60s, which was a good age for the time. She was buried in the church near the castle, and masses were said for her soul. Her grandchildren remembered her as a formidable but loving figure, a woman who had held the family together through difficult times. Agnes's later years were harder. She never stopped working, because peasants didn't retire. She worked until her body gave out. In her 40s, her back began to hurt constantly from decades of bending in fields, hauling water, lifting children. Her hands were gnarled from hard work. John died before her, in his 50s, from an accident in the fields. Agnes was devastated. They had been married for over 30 years. He had been her partner in everything. They had survived famines, plagues, wars. They had raised children together, buried children together. And now he was gone. Agnes moved in with her son, with Emma's husband's family. She helped as she could, watching the grandchildren, spinning thread, doing light tasks. But she was slowing down. Her eyesight was going. Her joints ached. She died in her late 50s, which was old for a peasant. She died in the same cottage where she had given birth to Emma, now inhabited by Emma and Emma's family. The village women prepared her body, washing it, wrapping it in a shroud. She was buried in the churchyard, in an unmarked grave, as most peasants were. But she was mourned. Her children and grandchildren mourned her. The village women who had known her all her life mourned her. She had been a good woman, a hard worker, a faithful Christian. She had done her duty. And that was what mattered. Let me talk about some of the challenges and hardships that medieval marriages faced. Because life was hard, and marriages had to endure much. War was a constant reality for noble families. Husbands and sons went to war, and often they didn't come back. Eleanor, over her lifetime, saw several wars. Robert fought in some of them. Each time he left, Eleanor didn't know if she would see him again. She sent him off with prayers and charms, with a blessing from the priest, with her kerchief to carry as a token. Some of her friends became widows young, their husbands killed in battle. These women had to manage estates alone, raise children alone, fend off men who tried to take advantage of them. It was a hard life. Plague was another constant threat. The Black Death in the mid-1300s killed perhaps a third of Europe's population. But even before and after that great pandemic, there were regular outbreaks of disease. Plague, smallpox, sweating sickness, fevers of unknown origin. When disease struck a household, it was the women who cared for the sick. They risked their own lives to tend to husbands, children, servants. Many women died this way, worn out by the stress and exposed to the illness. Agnes lived through an outbreak of plague in her village. It started with one family, then spread. People died quickly, within days of showing symptoms. The village priest died. Agnes's neighbor died, leaving small children orphaned. Agnes and John barricaded themselves in their cottage with their children, tried to have no contact with anyone. They prayed. They survived. But the village was devastated. Half the people dead. Fields left unharvested. It took years to recover. Famine was another specter. If the harvest failed, because of bad weather, or flooding, or blight, there was no food. Starvation was slow and terrible. People ate bark, grass, anything they could find. Children and the elderly died first. Agnes lived through a famine when she was in her 20s. The summer had been cold and wet, and the grain had rotted in the fields. By winter, there was almost nothing to eat. Agnes and John ate sparingly, giving most of their food to the children. Agnes lost a pregnancy during that winter, miscarried from malnutrition and stress. Her daughter, just 2 years old, died of fever made worse by hunger. These experiences marked people. They lived with the knowledge that disaster could strike at any time. That security was fragile. That life was brief and uncertain. And yet, they kept going. They planted again in spring. They had more children. They found joy where they could, in feast days, in weddings, in the small beauties of daily life. The church was a constant presence in medieval marriages. The church calendar shaped the year. Feast days and fast days, holy days when work was forbidden, days of penance and days of celebration. Marriage itself was a sacrament, one of the 7 holy sacraments of the church. This gave it a sacred character. A marriage was not just a legal contract or a social arrangement. It was a holy union, blessed by God, witnessed by the church. The church taught that marriage had 3 purposes. First, the procreation of children. Second, the avoidance of sin. It was better to marry than to burn with lust, as St. Paul said. Third, mutual companionship and support. The church also had rules about sex within marriage. There were forbidden times, Sundays, feast days, fast days, during Lent, during menstruation, during pregnancy, while nursing. There were forbidden acts, anything that couldn't lead to procreation. In theory, sex was only for making children, not for pleasure. In practice, of course, people didn't always follow these rules. The church was far away, the priest was only one man, and what happened in the privacy of the marriage bed was between husband and wife. But the rules hung over everything, creating a sense that sexuality was tainted with sin, even within marriage. Women confessed to priests, told them about their sins, received penance. Eleanor confessed regularly, as noble women were expected to. She confessed that she sometimes enjoyed her husband's touch, and the priest told her to do penance, to say extra prayers. She confessed that she sometimes felt angry at Robert, or at her mother-in-law, and the priest reminded her of the virtue of patience. Agnes confessed less often, maybe once a year at Easter when everyone was required to confess and take communion. She told the priest the usual things, that she had been lazy, had spoken sharply to John, had gossiped with neighbors. The priest gave her penance, say this many prayers, give this much to charity, and absolved her. The church was also a source of comfort. Prayers gave structure to the day. Saints could be petitioned for help. The Virgin Mary, especially, was a figure women could turn to. She understood women's suffering, had been a wife and mother herself. Women prayed to her during childbirth, during illness, during times of trouble. Let me tell you about some of the small joys that brightened medieval women's lives. Because it wasn't all hardship and suffering. There were moments of happiness, of beauty, of connection. For Eleanor, there were feast days when the great hall was decorated with greenery and flowers, when musicians played, when there was dancing and laughter. There were gifts at New Year, a piece of jewelry from Robert, a new gown, a book of poetry. There were the first flowers of spring, the taste of strawberries in summer, the smell of wood smoke in autumn, the stillness of snow in winter. There were her children. Watching William learn to walk, hearing his first words, seeing him grow into a capable young man. Her daughter's laughter as they played together. The pride she felt when her embroidery was praised. The satisfaction of managing the household well, of knowing that because of her work, everyone was fed and clothed and cared for. There were friendships with her ladies, the women who served her. They worked together, ate together, prayed together, talked together. They shared secrets, jokes, complaints. They formed bonds that lasted for years, for lifetimes. For Agnes, there were different joys, but they were just as real. The taste of fresh bread, warm from the oven. The feeling of sun on her face after a long winter. The way Emma laughed as a child, a bright burbling sound. The first green shoots coming up in the garden in spring, promising food for the months ahead. There were village festivals. At midsummer, they lit bonfires and danced around them. At harvest, there was a feast with the best food of the year, and everyone was happy, relieved that the work was done and the harvest was good. At Christmas, even in the darkest part of winter, there was celebration, singing, a sense of hope and wonder. There was the satisfaction of work well done. A successful brewing of ale, producing a batch that was clear and strong and good. A well-made piece of clothing that would last for years. A garden that yielded bountifully. There was John, coming in from the fields, tired but not too tired to smile at her, to tell her about his day, to eat the food she had prepared with appreciation. There were nights when they lay together in their bed, warm under their woolen blanket, and talked quietly before sleep. There was the comfort of a familiar presence, a partner, someone who shared the burdens of life. Let me tell you about marriage in the towns, because I've mostly talked about castles and villages, and towns were different. In a town like York or Norwich or London, there were more opportunities for women to work outside the home. Towns were centers of trade and craft. Guilds organized various professions, weavers, goldsmiths, bakers, chandlers. Imagine a woman named Alice, living in London in the year 1400. Alice's father was a prosperous mercer, a dealer in fine cloth. Alice learned the trade growing up, working in her father's shop, learning to judge the quality of silk and velvet, learning to keep accounts, learning to deal with customers. When Alice was about 18, she married Thomas, a young man who was also in the cloth trade. It was a good match. Their families knew each other, approved of each other. Thomas and Alice set up shop together, selling fine fabrics to wealthy Londoners. Alice worked alongside Thomas. She greeted customers, measured out cloth, took payment, managed the accounts. When Thomas traveled to buy stock, going to the docks when a ship came in from Italy or Flanders, Alice ran the shop alone. She was capable and customers trusted her. Alice and Thomas had children, 3 of them who survived infancy. Alice didn't stop working. She had a servant girl to help with the children, and when the children were very small, Alice would work with a baby strapped to her back or sitting in a cradle by the shop counter. This kind of partnership was common in urban marriages, especially among craftspeople and traders. Husband and wife worked together, both contributing to the family business. Women weren't just helpmates, they were often skilled workers in their own right. If Thomas died, Alice would likely continue the business. As a widow, she could join the Mercers Guild in her own right. She could train apprentices, make contracts, run the business as she saw fit. Many guild members were widows, respected and successful in their trades. Town life offered more social mobility than rural life. A successful merchant could become wealthy, could rise in status. His wife rose with him. Alice, if she and Thomas were very successful, might eventually hobnob with minor nobility, might see her children marry into genteel families. But town life also had dangers. Towns were crowded, unsanitary. Disease spread quickly. Fire was a constant threat, tightly packed wooden buildings with open flames for cooking and heating. Crime was more common than in rural areas. Alice had to be savvy, had to know how to protect herself and her family. Let me tell you about something that might surprise you: medieval people's attitudes toward love. We often think of medieval marriages as cold and practical, with no room for romantic love. But that's not entirely true. Romantic love was celebrated in medieval culture, especially among the nobility. Troubadours sang songs about courtly love, passionate, idealized love, often extramarital and unconsummated. Knights performed deeds to win the favor of ladies. This was the world of romance, of Lancelot and Guinevere, of Tristan and Isolde. But this courtly love was a literary convention, an ideal, not necessarily a reflection of real life. Real marriages were practical arrangements. But within those practical arrangements, real affection often grew. Letters between medieval spouses sometimes show genuine warmth. A husband writing to his wife from a journey, telling her he misses her, asking after her health and the children. A wife writing to her husband, sharing news, expressing concern for his safety. Eleanor, after many years of marriage to Robert, loved him in her way. She worried when he was in danger. She was glad to see him return. She missed him when he was gone. This wasn't the passionate, consuming love of romances, but it was real and it mattered. And sometimes, rarely but really, there was passionate love. There are records of couples who defied their families to marry for love, who ran away together, who chose each other against all advice. These marriages were scandalous, often ended badly, but they happened. Because people are people, and love is powerful. There were also same-sex relationships, though they were hidden, forbidden. The Church condemned sodomy as a terrible sin. Discovery could mean punishment, even death. But emotional relationships between women, called romantic friendships, were more accepted. Two women might live together, share a life, and as long as they were discreet, society generally tolerated it. Nuns in convents sometimes formed intense emotional bonds with each other. Some of the letters and writings that survive suggest relationships that were deeply loving, possibly physical. But we can't know for certain, and the women involved would never have spoken openly about it. Let me talk about the very end of life, about dying and death. Because this was part of the medieval marriage experience too. When Eleanor was dying, she was 64, an old woman by medieval standards. She called her family to her. Her son William, her daughters if they could come in time, her grandchildren. She wanted to say goodbye, to give them her blessing, to see them one last time. The priest came to give her the last rites, to hear her final confession, to give her communion one last time. This was important. A Christian death, with the proper rituals, was essential. It prepared the soul for judgment, offered the hope of heaven. Eleanor made her will, dictating it to a scribe. She left bequests, money for masses to be said for her soul, gifts to servants, specific items to each of her children. She asked to be buried next to Robert, in the family tomb in the church. And then, surrounded by family, attended by her faithful ladies, shriven and anointed, Eleanor died. Her body was washed and wrapped in a shroud. She lay in state in the chapel for a day, so people could come pay their respects. Then she was buried with ceremony, with prayers and chanting, with many candles lit around her tomb. Agnes's death was simpler but no less significant to those who loved her. When she fell ill, a fever that wouldn't break, Emma sent for the priest. He came and heard Agnes's confession, gave her communion. Agnes didn't have property to leave, but she told Emma where she had hidden a small bit of money, her savings from selling eggs over the years. She wanted it to go to her granddaughter, to help with the girl's dowry someday. Agnes died quietly, in the night, with Emma holding her hand. Emma washed her mother's body, wrapped her in a clean shroud. The village women came and sat with the body, praying. Agnes was buried the next day in the churchyard, with all the village attending. The priest said the prayers, the grave was filled in, and that was that. But Agnes wasn't forgotten. Emma told her children about their grandmother, about how hard she had worked, how much she had endured, how strong she had been. The stories passed down, and though Agnes's name was eventually forgotten, the legacy of her life, the values she had taught, the skills she had passed on, continued in her descendants. Now, as we come to the end of our long journey through medieval women's lives and marriages, let me reflect on what it all means. These women, Eleanor, Agnes, Marjorie, Alice, and all the countless real women they represent, lived lives so different from ours. They had so little control over their own fates. They married whom they were told to marry, bore child after child, worked until their bodies broke, died young by our standards. And yet, they were resilient. They found ways to exercise agency within tight constraints. They built relationships, communities, lives that had meaning and purpose. They loved and were loved. They took pride in their work. They found moments of joy and beauty in a harsh world. They were not helpless victims. They were not passive objects. They were human beings, fully complex, fully capable, making choices within the limits of their time and place. Medieval marriage was not the fairy tale of a princess and a prince falling in love and living happily ever after. It was practical, it was hard work, it was sometimes joyful and sometimes painful. It was life. And these women lived it. They deserve to be remembered, to be honored, to have their stories told. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, think of them. Think of Eleanor in her castle, managing a great estate with intelligence and skill. Think of Agnes in her cottage, working from dawn to dusk, raising children, enduring hardship, finding small joys. Think of all the women across the medieval centuries, living their lives, doing their best, leaving behind a world that their labor and love helped to build. Sleep well, dear ones. And as you sleep, may you dream of the past, of those long ago women, and may you find peace in the knowledge that life, however hard, is also full of resilience and grace. Good night.